Vaccines, Wading Through the Confusion, a Public Health Virtual Town Hall Meeting by the California Department of Public Health. Our discussion today will focus primarily on vaccines as they relate to infants and children. Teen and adult vaccines may be taken up at a later time. The science behind vaccines is complex, so in order to keep the conversation moving, we're going to reserve the right to refer any in-depth sidebars to the website where you can find additional links and information. We are joined today by a studio audience of parents and concerned citizens. For viewers, online chat rooms will be open to carry on multitask text discussions during the presentation. Members of the State Department of Public Health will be in each chat room to hear your views and comments. We encourage you to share comments and post questions during the presentation. After the presentation, we'll select some questions to address during our live audio discussion. The rest of the questions will be posted to the forum blog on the website and will be answered there. We hope that you will find this a useful place to continue discussions regarding vaccine immunization issues. We'll be asking a series of live polling questions and reporting the results online. Let's begin with our first poll question now. What vaccine-related concerns do you hear most often in your practice or community? Hello, I'm Lars Ulberg, your host for Vaccines, Wading Through the Confusion. Vaccines have made the world a safer place, but there's confusion about vaccine safety that's causing some parents to wonder whether they should vaccinate their children at all. While most Americans still immunize routinely, a tiny but vocal opposition is using new media to turn up the volume on provocative counter messages. Their anti-vaccine arguments are finding footholds in sympathetic groups like parents worried about autism. The result is that vaccine-preventable outbreaks are on the rise, putting all of us, especially infants too young to be immunized, at risk. Is there a link between vaccines and autism? Are vaccines filled with toxins? Is it better to immunize or risk getting the disease? And how does it affect you if your neighbors choose not to vaccinate their children? It's time to unravel the confusion around vaccine safety and help parents make decisions that benefit their children. Now let us join our distinguished panelists as they address this important public health issue. Joining us today, Dr. Christine Sheedy, Associate Director of Communication Science at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Mr. Ken Reibel is a journalist and creator of the Autism News Beat blog. Ken has a 13-year-old child of his own with autism. Dr. Rahul Parikh is a pediatrician from Northern California with Kaiser Permanente Medical Center. He deals with patients asking questions about vaccines every day. Dr. Stephen M. Pearl, Professor of Clinical Sciences and Adjunct Professor of Mechanical Engineering at the University of Bridgeport, Connecticut. He has the distinction of being the first chiropractor in the United States to be appointed to the university's faculty to teach chiropractic. Dr. Mark Sawyer, Professor of Clinical Pediatrics and a Pediatric Infectious Disease Specialist at the University of California San Diego School of Medicine and Rady Children's Hospital. He's also an advisor to the California Department of Public Health Immunization Branch. Dr. David G. Amaral is Research Director and a founding member of the MIND Institute. The organization is dedicated to understanding the biological basis of autism and other neurodevelopmental disorders with the goal of improving prevention and treatment. Dr. S. Michael Marcy is a primary care pediatrician from Southern California and clinical professor of pediatrics at the USC and UCLA Schools of Medicine. He's also an investigator with the UCLA Center for Vaccine Research and the CDC. Mrs. Frankie Milley is founder and executive director of Meningitis Angels. She and her husband Bob lost their only child, Ryan, to meningococcal meningitis in 1998. She's a tireless advocate for immunization and children's health. And Mrs. Jamie Betters is our parent on the panel today. She's a dietitian and a mother of 3. She's dealing with vaccine questions right now. I want to begin the discussion. We have a lot of doctors on the panel, but I want to begin with a parent. So I want to ask you, Mrs. Betters, what's the story? What happened with you and your children recently?
I have 3 children, and I've always immunized without question, just taken them to their appointments and done what I was told to do. And my older 2 children had mild reactions, low-grade fever, things that were explained. But recently, my 15-month-old, at his 12-month checkup, when he received the big combination vaccine, had a reaction that started out as a persistent low-grade fever and a mild body rash. And then he just was not himself. He was very lethargic. He stopped using his sign language. He stopped using the words that he had built in his vocabulary, and his equilibrium was off. He wasn't even able to walk more than a couple of steps without falling. And it was really alarming for me. And the final stage of it was that he broke out in hives. And so we weren't able to tie it all together. And when I called the pediatrician, it was presumed that something triggered his immune system. It's never happened since. And it was right within that 2-week window from when he received his immunizations that all of these reactions happened. And so here I have this appointment tomorrow, and he's due for more shots, and I don't know what to do.
Dr. Parikh, you're a pediatrician. I'm going to make you her pediatrician for the time being. What would you say to her?
You know, the first thing is I would take your concern very seriously. There's a tendency, I think, across some pediatricians tend to not want to address the issue because they're sort of nervous about what it means when your kid has a vaccine reaction. But we should start thinking about what it is, if there is something in the vaccine that may be, and then there are things that kids can have allergic reactions to. We should probably look a little bit for those things.
Very good. All right, Dr. Sawyer, is it common protocol in a situation like this then to adjust the normal vaccine schedule?
Well, the common protocol is to avoid or be very cautious about giving a vaccine to which you think someone had a severe or allergic reaction. The challenge, since we do give many vaccines together, is sorting out which vaccine may have caused a reaction like this, or if it even was from a vaccine. The difficulty that physicians face is that many other things can do this. Viral infections could cause many of those same symptoms, and it's essentially impossible for us, especially after the fact, to figure out what caused it in her particular case.
So, Dr. Sheedy, in terms of the national scope, now how representative are her concerns?
We of course do hear about experiences like this, and some of us, have gone through something similar. And I feel for you, Jamie, because I can imagine the anxiety that you're feeling. Parents are all different, and we've gone around the country and talked to many of them, and their concerns really span the spectrum, some of whom say they have no concerns, others who are really highly concerned. The top concerns that we hear about do have to do with things like fever following vaccination, concerns about the number of shots that a child is given in one doctor's visit, and of course concerns about autism, because that issue's been so visible recently.
Okay. So are you feeling better about this now?
I feel like my concerns here are being heard, but I guess not knowing if there's something in all vaccines. Am I playing with fire, putting something into him that he's sensitive to? Is there ever going to be a time where he has a reaction that, causes some type of permanent situation? These are questions that I have that.
Right. Well, let's see if we can get it answered. Maybe Dr. Marcy, would you be able to address her concerns about what's in the vaccine?
Well, the vaccines contain a lot of ingredients, and as Dr. Sawyer mentioned, whether there's an allergic reaction to one of them is going to be very difficult to ascertain, particularly if you consider the alternative that this may be an intermittent viral infection as well. Not only do you have the products against which you're trying to protect the child, but you have adjuvants in there which enhance the immune response or lengthen it, and you have stabilizers which keep it from reacting to extremes in temperature, and they also present bulk to the vaccine. In other words, if you have 10,000 or 100,000 viruses, those don't take up any volume. And so you have to add something that gives this vaccine bulk that you can see and dilute and that you can put into a syringe. You have antibiotics in the vaccines, streptomycin, neomycin, polymyxin, some antibiotics which may cause an allergic reaction, although penicillin is not permitted in any vaccines. You have residuals left over from the manufacturing process, very small amounts, but nonetheless they're there. And you have the preservatives, which of course, thimerosal being the one that has been a cause of concern, but there are 3 others that have been in there that have been not associated with any difficulties. All of these have been deemed to be safe, and whether or not any of these could cause an allergic reaction remains, of course, a matter of conjecture.
There's a lot of scientific words in there. Are you reassured by that?
Well, it clarifies a lot for me in terms of that certainly it could be a possibility that there's something in there that's triggering. I myself have a sensitivity to a certain class of antibiotics. So I guess I am feeling like I'm getting a lot of good information, but whether I feel empowered enough to know exactly what to request when I go to my doctor's appointment tomorrow is a different story.
All right. Well, let's see if Dr. Sawyer can help you out.
Yeah, I think this situation and all the factors that Dr. Marcy laid out in your situation illustrate just how complicated this is. And I don't think you can be expected to go into your doctor and say, this is what I want.
Right.
I think this is the situation where you need to have confidence in your doctor and talk through all of these issues, talk through the concerns, and together come up with a strategy that makes you comfortable and hopefully allows your child to be immunized with as many of the vaccines as possible.
Well, let's do that. Let's let you talk to your doctor, Dr. Parikh.
As a parent myself, if I saw or experienced what you experienced with your son, his son, I would be very, very concerned and scared myself. What happened sounds like a rare event, and before you proceed in your case, I would ask some very, very pointed questions, and also maybe expect that there should be some testing if it's possible to look at what may have been the underlying problem. I think I'd be giving you bad advice if I were to tell you not to immunize your child as close to the schedule as possible.
I believe you had something to add, perhaps?
I think it's important that what Jamie is saying is she wants to be an informed parent, and I think as pediatricians we all appreciate the informed parent. It's very important that we have an idea of what you're concerned about so that we can answer those concerns. But what's interesting is there have been studies done that in the very end, the acceptance of immunizations from a pediatrician deal with trust. Do you trust your pediatrician? If you trust him or her, then it's acceptable. If you don't, you probably should seek care elsewhere and find someone who you do trust, who answers your questions, who gives you enough time. And I think that's critical.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk a little bit about that. Certainly the number of sources of information available to parents has skyrocketed with the internet. Actually, Mr. Reibel, you spend a lot of time on the internet blogging and talking to people with some of these same concerns. What do you find?
Well, I think a lot of the concern that you're seeing right now over vaccines wouldn't have been talked about 20 years ago before the internet. It's really the internet that brings together this diverse community, people, really literally from all over the world to talk about these concerns. The problem is that the information that's getting to them, there's really no filter for it. And so you see a lot of confirmation bias and wishful thinking and so on. And then you just, basically you're seeing like-minded people gravitating together and being heard and actually being taken seriously, which is quite hazardous to our health.
Mm-hmm. So what's happening out there? I guess, Dr. Sheedy, you've been tracking this on a national scale. What are you finding? What's developing as a result of accumulation of fears and the available resources on the internet unfiltered?
Yeah, I mean, it's true. The internet has totally changed the landscape, and it's allowed for a type of peer-to-peer influence that didn't exist before. I mean, if you think about if we go on the internet to buy a book or decide what movie to see, what reviews do you look at? The professional critical reviews, or do you look at the people who've, the reviews by the people who've read the book or seen the movie? We look at what our peers say about it, and immunizations is no exception.
Dr. Parikh, What kind of things are you hearing in practice?
I'm hearing a lot of parents going on the internet and finding information that they're concerned about. And I would absolutely encourage you to bring that information to your physician. I think there's a tendency in the community for doctors to their spines tighten up when they start getting questions about vaccines, because they get uncomfortable and they feel like maybe this isn't going to go the way they want it to, which is to protect, for the child to be protected against serious illnesses. We can't take that approach. We have to accept and acknowledge and be empathic to the questions and concerns that parents are bringing to us. That being said, we also need to look at the sources that they're bringing to us. There's one doctor who's open all the time, and that's Dr. Google. And Dr. Google, about a year ago, I Googled autism into the Google search engine, which frankly, 2/3 to 3/4 of people start their internet searches by going to a search engine, not a website, as we've talked about. And if they were to Google autism, they'd find what's called a scraper page, which is a page that would take you to 10 different organizations, most of which are anti-vaccine organizations that deal with autism. That's how people are starting their searches if they're not familiar with autism and vaccine. And so you have to educate your patients not only about medicine, but how they're looking for information and maybe where to go.
Well, all right, so there are a lot of different possible sources of information. I want to go to one alternate source. I want to ask you, Dr. Pearl, from the chiropractic perspective, do people come to you and ask about vaccines, and what happens when they do?
Definitely some patients talk to their chiropractors, and I think people who pick chiropractors, they sort of pick them in sort of two broad areas. There's those who see chiropractors as alternative healthcare providers who are going to provide more information that way, and then there's those who see us as essentially mainstream doctors who deal with conservative management of spinal disorders. The response they're going to get is going to run along that gamut also. Those who are much more alternative healthcare providers may give them rather anti-vaccination type information, and the things that people are seeing on the internet, those have been in some chiropractors' offices for years. And then there'll be others at the other end who are saying, talk to your pediatrician, it's not our area of expertise, and that's where you should go. So you get the whole range.
So there's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of range of advice, okay? What do we do with that? Overall, let me ask this question. Do you think we're safer?
We are definitely safer now. The amount of effort that is going into scrutinizing vaccines and vaccine safety has just exploded in the last 10 years in response to the concerns. As physicians and certainly as public health officials, we recognize that this is a crisis. This is a problem for our country. If people choose not to get immunized, the diseases that we've managed to almost eliminate from vaccines are going to come back. So we need to do something about it, and something is being done about it. There are a series of networks of research groups that have been formed specifically to look at vaccine safety. And every single new potential reaction to a vaccine gets scrutinized immediately. There's a system called the VAERS system, the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, which anybody, a doctor, a parent, a person who felt they got a reaction to a vaccine can file that report. That gets looked at, and people start to study it. So I think we're much safer than we've ever been from vaccines.
Mr. Reibel, do you find people who have a kind of an all or nothing attitude, like I'm scared, I'm concerned, and I'm not vaccinating? Do you find that out there?
Yeah, you do hear that. And what I'm finding is what we call the anti-vaccine community is actually split between the people who say, well, I'm not anti-vaccine, I just want them to be safe, without defining what safe means. And then you have the people who say, vaccines have never prevented a disease. And there's an awful lot of that out there too.
Is there a valid reason not to vaccinate at all? I mean, is that a defensible position if someone says, you know what, I don't want to vaccinate my children?
As an advocate for children, I don't think that's a defensible position. Now, certainly there are extremely rare reasons that an individual should not get vaccinated, perhaps with any vaccine or certainly with certain vaccines. But in general, vaccines are safe. The diseases that we prevent through vaccines are out there. They're dangerous. I see them in my practice of infectious disease all the time. And so parents who think that their children are not at risk because they haven't heard about this disease in their community are wrong. And we learned that in San Diego just recently this year when we had an outbreak of measles. We had not seen measles, for years in San Diego, and suddenly we had 12 cases of measles, all in groups of kids who had not been immunized. And that problem was repeated across our country several more times during this year. And that is just a harbinger of what can happen if this problem continues. We are going to start to see outbreaks of disease again that we thought were eliminated, including things like polio.
Frankie, and now you have a pretty dramatic story regarding a vaccine-preventable disease. You want to tell us that?
Yes. My 18-year-old son became ill with a fever and an earache on Father's Day, 1998. And within 14 hours, he was laying in an emergency room with blood coming from every orifice of his body, and he died. And nobody could really tell me. I'd been in the medical field for years myself, and I knew meningitis could kill you, but I had no idea of what it could really do to the body. Ryan was our only child, so not only did we stand there and watch our child literally bleed to death before our eyes in a matter of hours, then we had to turn him over to a county morgue who proceeded to also dissect him and do an autopsy to find out what killed him. And within 48 hours, I found out there was a vaccine that could have saved Ryan's life. And I was pretty angry because I felt like those people who are responsible for educating me, the government, my healthcare providers, all those people had never educated me about there was a vaccine that maybe that age group should have. So that's why other parents and myself joined together and actually educated ourselves on the vaccine and the diseases.
So what do you think when you hear people say they're not going to vaccinate?
I feel sick and I feel scared. And I think about the countless hundreds of children within our network that are blind and deaf and have limb amputations and are on kidney transplant lists and have severe learning disabilities and severe emotional disturbances and have 15 to 20, 30 seizures a day, which every one leaves them a little bit more debilitated. I think about the countless families that are ending in divorce and financial ruin when a vaccine could have prevented all that. I truly believe that we live in a country where no one should die from a vaccine-preventable disease.
But there is a kind of a counter feeling out there. There is a sense from a lot of people that vaccines themselves can cause problems. Mr. Reibel, tell us your story.
Well, my 13-year-old son was diagnosed with a pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. That was back in fall of '98. He just turned 3. I had no idea. I never thought about autism other than watching Rain Man, like I think most people can say. The first thing I did was I went on the internet, and there it was. This was only 8 months, I think, after the Lancet article that Wakefield authored came out, and there it was in black and white that the measles virus causes autism. And I printed everything out, and I went to my general practitioner. I said, look at this. And he wouldn't even hold it. He looked at it and said, no, don't listen to that. And then he explained why. And I do trust the guy. I'm still with him. He's been my doctor for 14 years now. And he patiently explained. He said, this is just a hypothesis. If they really think it's true, they need to go through the study and then the research and then test the hypothesis like everybody else does.
Right.
You play by the rules. And I understood that.
Right, but for a couple of hours,
Yeah.
you felt like you had drawn a connection.
Or a week or two even, yeah. I mean, I was thinking, boy, this is a lawsuit here. This is terrible. They made my kid autistic.
Right, okay. So you had that feeling.
Oh, absolutely.
But research brought you out of it and really trust with your physician.
Absolutely.
Okay, but autism has been linked time and time again to vaccines, right? We use that term fairly loosely. What are we talking about?
First of all, I'd have to say we don't know what causes autism, and that level of ambiguity leads many to what might be considered superstitious beliefs or their own hunches as to what causes autism. We know that you can get autism either through probably genetic roots, but also environmental roots, and then probably most likely it's genes and environment interacting.
So what about the connection with vaccines? That seems to be the core of our issue regarding vaccines. What
Yeah.
about that?
Well, so here again, I think we have some pretty good evidence. There is really no clear link between MMR and autism. In studies in Scandinavia, for example, where children have had MMR or not had MMR, you're actually a little bit more likely to get autism if you haven't had MMR. We were talking about the early studies that Ken was talking about. Those studies have never been replicated. So in science, you can come up with a hypothesis, and the early hypothesis that MMR caused problems with the gut that then led to autism, reasonable hypothesis, but somebody should have been able to prove that or disprove it by doing the same study again and finding the same results. That's never happened. That study has never been replicated. And so I think it's quite clear that at least from the MMR point of view, there is no clear link between MMR and autism.
Mm-hmm. Now, a lot of comment on that. Do you want to speak to that?
Actually, I think it's about the terminology used. Studies have been replicated. The results have not been replicated.
Right.
It gives the impression that someone hasn't done the experiment again. The experiment's been done, in essence.
The results haven't been
But the
replicated.
results have
Right.
not been replicated.
Dr. Marcy.
I think an important point here is it's true that Wakefield studies done in 1993 have never been confirmed. What's important is that there were more than a dozen papers published in the ensuing 5 years after his article came out in 1993, none of which confirmed his findings. They received very little attention. What received attention in the media was the original findings. So our source of information promulgated the myth. Then in 1998, he published a paper saying that there was a relationship between inflammatory bowel disease and autism, autistic enterocolitis, he called it. This paper also was never confirmed. None of these findings were confirmed. That never received attention in the press.
How do you feel about the green the vaccine movement? If you go to the CDC website or if you go to the FDA website, you do see these things listed in trace amounts, formaldehyde and aluminum, et cetera, et cetera. And to people who are not sure that the science has been conclusive, the fact that there are trace amounts is very significant. What do you say to them to diffuse that concern?
Well, I think first of all, you mentioned the greening of vaccines, and I think that's becoming more and more of an issue as people have expressed concern over the contents. I think the purity of vaccines is increasing. We've removed thimerosal from virtually every vaccine. In 2003, from the routine immunizations, there are now 2 influenza vaccines that still contain thimerosal, but you can avoid those and get thimerosal-free influenza. So you needn't get any thimerosal anymore because the pharmaceutical firms have essentially removed it from all the vaccines in this country. Second of all, they're improving their purity in their production methods so that they don't need preservatives of any sort. Those are hopefully going away. And new technology, using DNA vaccines, for instance, which simply don't require any of the different impurities in the vaccine or don't contain the impurities that are in the vaccine, have also improved that likelihood. They've used latex-free vials now to the point where there's no latex when you puncture a vial, so that latex allergy isn't expressed. There's great concern on the part of the pharmaceutical firms in greening, as you say, the vaccines.
Dr. Amaral?
If it were that easy, if we could simply eliminate thimerosal and there would be no more autism, I think everybody in the field of autism research would jump on it. But as it turns out, there hasn't, again, been any link shown in terms of epidemiological studies. And interestingly, here in California, we're doing a naturalistic experiment. Essentially, all thimerosal has been eliminated from vaccines that go to children and pregnant mothers. And if you look again at the numbers of children that are coming into the Department of Developmental Services, that is, how many children are diagnosed with autism, if you took out all the mercury in 2003, and kids are generally diagnosed by the time they're 3 and certainly by the time they're 5, we're now at 2009, we should have detected a sharp decrease. In fact, there has been no sharp decrease. The numbers keep going up. So again, I think that that's strong local evidence that thimerosal, although the wisdom of using something like that as a preservative could be questioned, there is no link between that preservative in vaccines and the occurrence of autism.
Dr. Sawyer, you concur?
Absolutely. I mean, that's the easiest experiment that was ever done on this question. We just took the thimerosal out of the vaccines and autism has not gone away. In fact, it continues to go up. So if anyone out there is still thinking that thimerosal has something to do with autism, I think they just need to read the newspaper to realize that's not the case. So again, what we need to do is turn our attention to other causes of autism because certainly with enough effort we're going to be able to eventually dissect this. And it's a very complicated topic.
Dr. Emmerich?
Well, I wanted to make the point that just because we're dismissing, because of data, the fact that these additives to vaccines are probably not causing autism, it's not to say that there isn't something in the environment that might be causing autism. I think it's extremely important for us to get on with the work of figuring out what it is that's causing autism.
Is there a real cost to this distraction?
Again, there's a very limited amount of financial resources that go into autism research. As a scientist, we spend most of our time trying to get funding to do science, to actually do the experiments. And it's the kind of science that we do are very powerful now. We have incredibly powerful tools, but they're very costly. So if you divert funds into looking at low probability causes of autism, you're going to take it away from those that are affecting more and more of the children in the United States and in the world. We should be spending more of our resources on looking at what makes perhaps a child like Jamie's child particularly vulnerable to a vaccine or other kinds of environmental influences. Ultimately, some point in time, maybe 20 years from now, we'll be able to identify risk factors that would make children more vulnerable to environmental insults. The only way we're going to get there is if we do the research now. It's costly research and there's limited resources. That's where I think we should be putting our resources.
Mm-hmm. What's the impact of this? The science is really good, but what's the buzz out there, Dr. Sawyer?
This is the frustration for pediatricians and people in the immunization community, that the buzz out there still is that there is a link. In fact, you introduced this discussion by saying there is a link has been made between vaccines and autism. There is no link. It's been studied up and down and sideways in every way you could possibly study it. The entire medical community is convinced that there is no link. And the concern I have is that all of the other causes that were outlined, the genetics and other environmental factors, are not getting the funding they need to figure out what the real cause is because so much time and attention has been spent on vaccines. I think we are done with the question about vaccines and autism, and we need to move on to other questions.
Oh, good. Ken, are you feeling that too from your blog communication?
Yes, I am. And I'm also hearing that some of the best and brightest researchers are actually intimidated by the anti-vax people. And they're saying, no, I'm not going near this. I don't want to do the research you're talking about because I don't want my kid's face to show up on some wacko website.
So Dr. Parikh, now you talk to people. I assume you've heard about this also. What do you say?
Yeah, I've written about it. I've heard about it. I have a very simple message now for parents in my office who come in with this question about vaccines, and that is quite simply, vaccines are safe and effective. They do have side effects, as Jamie was potentially talking about, some more serious than others, but neurodevelopmental disorders like autism is not one of those side effects, period. And any science or anything that they have, anything that they've heard that suggests that, is probably the equivalent of National Enquirer science. It's essentially junk science. However, this discussion, although we in our minds have closed the discussion, it's not going away. At one point, it was the MMR vaccine, and when we sort of disproved that link, they moved to thimerosal. And now that we've disproved that link, we've moved to aluminum. Moving the target is a strategy that's being used by a small but very loud group of people known as the active anti-vaccine community.
Dr. Brown?
On that point, part of it is, if we look at Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions, people have a paradigm. And if their paradigm is that there's something you gave my kids that made them sick, so now I started off with MMR, and you got rid of that, I'm just going to modify, I'm going to stay with my paradigm that it's something you and the evil drug companies gave, and I just have to keep morphing my paradigm because I'm not going to change to an evidence-based paradigm. I'm going to change with this emotion that says it's something you did because I'm having this problem with my child, and it must have been something you did because it couldn't be my genes, it couldn't have been something else, but I have to stay within my paradigm.
All right, so let me get back to you. Jamie, how are you feeling at this point?
I actually feel a lot better. One thing I wanted to say about, where people get their information, even I, working in healthcare, and know that the .edus and the .govs are the most, credible place to go. It doesn't mean that you don't get sucked into some of the .orgs, especially the .orgs, that look so professional. And it's tempting to not kind of read through it. So it has been very reassuring to hear that there is no validity to that for me. And I also want to make it clear that I want to immunize my children, okay? I plan to. I just want to know what is the purpose of an alternative schedule.
So you're feeling good
I am. I'm
about
feeling,
the
yes.
contents
Right.
of the vaccines.
Yes.
Now your concern is that perhaps there are too many too soon.
Well, what's the purpose? Is it really just to make parents feel better? Is there real legitimacy behind overwhelming the immune system? I mean, why is it there, and who should know about
Well,
it?
you're sitting next to the man who can answer you. Go right ahead.
I would say the purpose of the alternative schedule is to make some people feel better and to sell books. The book that tells you what alternative schedule to follow. As a generalization, there is no advantage to an alternative schedule. There's no evidence that an alternative schedule will reduce the kind of reaction that your child might have had from a vaccine, because we don't know whether it was a single ingredient in one vaccine or whether it was some other combination. And the danger in the alternative schedule is that you're delaying protection. So my concern is parents think, oh shoot, I'll just spread these vaccines out, that's no big problem. They don't realize that these diseases are around us all the time, and they are dangerous diseases. Even chickenpox. Many parents dismiss chickenpox as a not severe disease. I saw a child die this year of chickenpox because they were exposed. It happened to be a child with leukemia, but they were exposed to a healthy child with chickenpox who didn't have to have chickenpox because they could have been immunized. So the diseases are here. Measles is here. Polio is just a plane ride away. And parents need to know that and need to realize that delaying vaccines is just leaving their kids at risk for a longer period of time than they need to be. I mean, you don't delay putting them in a car seat. You don't delay putting their seatbelts on. Why would you delay? It just doesn't make sense to me.
Now you mentioned chickenpox. One of the things that we've heard is that some people prefer a natural immunity approach. How do you feel about that?
Natural immunity is great, but it comes at a significant cost. That's the problem. It is true that the immune reaction you get to natural infections is more broad-based and generally stronger than many of the vaccines we have. But it comes at the price. It comes at the price of some children getting very sick and some children dying from the disease because we allowed them to get natural infection.
So, Frankie, when you hear that people are going to wait a day or a week or months to get a vaccine, how do you feel?
That's really frightening to me because within our organization we have several children that for one reason or another didn't get the third Prevnar to prevent pneumococcal meningitis. As a result, they developed pneumococcal meningitis. And those same children, one or two have died from that, but we also have two that I can think of that are severely debilitated. And they're 6 and 7 years old now, and they have vocabularies of 30 words, and they have multiple seizures every day. They're deaf. We're talking about they missed one in the sequel, and that happened. And when a parent starts telling me, oh, I think we just need to postpone, or we need to spread them out, I just get physically ill because I think of what can happen.
So, Jamie, you've expressed an interest in an alternate schedule. Dr. Parikh, what would you say to her?
I would rather you immunize your child in some interval other than not immunize at all. So if that's going to make you comfortable, let's talk about it. Now, the specific alternative vaccine schedule that most of us are referring to, which is from Sears' book, I believe, is not the one that I particularly agree with. From what I've seen of it, I would prefer to immunize you first for certain diseases and then let you come back in a couple weeks for the other two. Again, that's not my first choice, but I want to make sure that your child's health is protected.
Dr. Pearl, you had something to say?
Well, I was going to follow up on the concept that the diseases that people can get are out of people's realm of consciousness. And we're fearful of things that we see, and we're not fearful of things we don't see. I mean, if you read Freakonomics, and he talks about fear of sending your child to a home that has a pool or that has a handgun. And most people have the fear of sending a child to a home that has a handgun. A handgun, when they really should be fearful of sending their child to a home with a pool. It's the same kind of thing that if Americans don't see the children that are in your network, Frankie, they think, well, those diseases happen in the third world. They don't happen here, so it's okay if I don't get immunized. Or it's okay if I get it naturally. They don't see the patients that you see, Dr. Sawyer. They're not on TV, and so there's no reason for them to have fear for those diseases. Part of it is that we have this border and we're far away from other countries, and we think that protects us from these third world diseases, but it doesn't. You know, people come by airplane. They don't much come by boat anymore, but they come by airplane, and they can bring those things that we haven't seen for years, and we're not in a immunological vacuum here in the United States protected from the third world anymore.
Dr. Marcy, are we victims of our own success?
Well, I think we are. I think a lot of diseases have declined and we don't see them, and I think there's good experience in Great Britain where there was concern over side effects from the pertussis vaccine. They stopped giving it, and there were dramatic rises in deaths due to pertussis in Great Britain. In Japan, the same thing happened when they stopped pertussis vaccine. As a consequence of Wakefield's studies, the measles vaccine was briefly refused in Great Britain. Deaths from measles rose as well. The concept that Dr. Pearl was mentioning about the borders, I think we are well aware in California that strawberries contained hepatitis A. There was an outbreak of hepatitis A among school children as a consequence of imported disease. So clearly we're not in a vacuum, as he said, and clearly not giving vaccines can result in fairly serious consequences. I think Dr. Sawyer mentioned that polio is still out there. We've not eradicated polio from the world, and somebody traveling from an African country which contains polio, although it's highly unlikely it would be transmitted in this country because there's such a high immunization rate, it is not impossible among groups that do not immunize their children as a matter of cultural policy. And that has been shown to occur in Pennsylvania when previous years polio broke out there. So we're not in a vacuum, as Dr. Pearl said, and we have to be vigilant against outside disease.
So, Dr. Sawyer, can you explain this phrase, herd immunity? Not necessarily feeling like a complimentary phrase, but herd immunity. What is that?
Yeah, people don't like to be summarized as a herd, but
They do in Texas.
well, maybe we should let Frankie address
We
that.
still say that in Texas. We get it.
So the real concept of the herd, us as a herd, is that many of the infections that we've talked about here that are preventable through vaccines are extremely contagious. Measles is probably the best example. That is, somebody sitting across the room from you can get measles from you without you ever getting any closer. And because they're so contagious, if you have even a small percent of your community that's not protected through immunization, then an outbreak can happen. So the concept of herd immunity is you have to have a high enough level of protection across everybody to prevent outbreaks of disease. And that level that's needed varies somewhat by the disease and the vaccine. But in general, we're talking 80, 85, 90% of people have to be immunized, some diseases even higher than that, in order to prevent an outbreak. And the thing I think many people don't appreciate about outbreaks is that once an outbreak gets going, then even people who have been immunized may get the disease, because vaccines are not 100% effective. Some people don't respond to vaccines. Some people miss vaccines inadvertently, not because they're trying to avoid them, they just haven't gotten around to it. And so once an outbreak gets going, then everybody is involved, both those who aren't immunized, those who are immunized. And that's what we're really concerned about in the United States, that this bad information, this unwarranted concern about vaccine safety in general is lowering our herd immunity to a point where we're going to start to see diseases again that we haven't seen for years.
Is the CDC concerned about this?
It is something that's, of course, a concern. Herd immunity is vitally important, and unfortunately, when we've been out there sort of testing messages that communicate about herd immunity, they don't really resonate with parents. They're not all that persuasive. What we found is today's parents are first and understandably foremost concerned about their individual child, and a little less concerned about the impact on the broader community. So, you know, we'd like to see that changed, and one thing that does resonate, though, is when we talk about protecting your family members by getting vaccinated yourself, because, you know, our own homes are little herds, then the parents really do respond to that.
So let's talk about some of the messages that resonate, some of the things that need to be said. Let me touch base with you, Jamie. How are you feeling now about your questions?
I feel that what you guys just described with the herd immunity is something that hadn't even really entered my, thought process about, again, as you said, I'm just, I'm a mother and I'm just sort of instinctively driven to protect my children, and wanting to do that by getting them immunized, but then seeing the negative reaction made me really question what is right, and then being influenced by so many different outlets of information. I really hadn't thought about that greater impact. Children that go to my kids' school who choose not to immunize, that they're putting my kids, in danger and at risk. So that's a much more serious angle, I think, that I hadn't even really been aware of.
Another issue on the herd immunity is it allows the anti-vaccination folks to have an anecdote that says my children weren't sick. Now, if the herd is mostly immunized and their child is now within the herd, they're safe, and now they can go spread that anecdote to other people by saying, well, I didn't get my kids immunized and they didn't get sick. Dr. Preek?
It's a hot, flat, and crowded world. And maybe 150 years ago, it would be easy for an outbreak in one village not to spread to the next. But in 2009, all you have to do is have an unimmunized child get sick with a vaccine-preventable disease, get picked up from one school, go down 40 miles south on the freeway to where they live, or to the park, or to a birthday party where there may be an infant child who's not immunized because they're too young to be, and then that child is at risk. And we talk about teachable moments. The San Diego measles outbreak was exactly that. A question of not just children who got sick being at risk, but children who had to be quarantined for weeks at a time because they were exposed to measles and they weren't immunized because they were too young to be. Now, what does that do not only to the family, but sort of as an economic cost? I mean, parents have to miss work, kids have to be out of school. Their entire fabric of their lives is disrupted because of the lack of herd immunity.
Now, Dr. Sawyer, you mentioned San Diego before, and people have heard about this. I want you to explain it, but what I want you to do is tell us what people haven't heard yet about how much the impact was. There was really quite a significant impact from that, wasn't there?
Yeah, it was really an eye-opener for me personally, and I think for the physicians in San Diego and to the community in general. I mean, the size of our outbreak was really quite small when you think about it. We had 12 actual cases. But as Dr. Parikh said, the impact went way beyond that, because the cases we had were in schools, they were in restaurants, they were in movie theaters, and as a result, many, many, many additional people were exposed. And because of the contagious nature of measles, they had to be quarantined or isolated. And in the end, more than 100 children were isolated to their house for periods of 2 to 3 weeks. The health department spent endless hours on this, trying to track these down. And then to get back to the point Dr. Parikh made, 3 of the cases we had were not among children of parents who were concerned about vaccines. They were not about people who were out and about in the community. They were simply parents who took their child to the doctor's office for a routine visit, just to get a checkup. But on that day, when they were there, a child with the measles was there. And as a result, just from being in the waiting room, that's all they did. They went and sat in the waiting room. 3 babies under a year got the measles. Fortunately, none of them got severely ill, but they could have. They could have died with the measles. When we had outbreaks of measles in 1989 and 90 in the United States, all physicians saw kids die with the measles. We had 3 die in San Diego. And people just have lost sight of that the risk, you never know where the risk is going to be. Who would think going to your doctor's office you're going to get exposed to measles? You know, we had not seen measles, but it happened. And the same can happen with the other diseases.
So, messages that resonate regarding vaccines. The examples are good. We're talking to people certainly more, and we have resources, online resources, websites, official websites from the CDC. We also have independent ventures to speak about these issues. In your practice and in your experience, I want to hear from all of you a little bit about what has worked, what kinds of messages have worked, and by all means, share them with us because we want to hear them.
I think putting a face on the disease and letting other parents, because I know, you know, my heart is just in fear, Jamie, for you. I mean, that has to be a very scary thing, especially coming from a parent who's buried a child, who's lost a child. And I just think we have to just start getting out there, and it's going to take parents like myself who can go to parents like Jamie and say, let me tell you what happens when you don't immunize. Let me introduce you to my child whose life is a nightmare, who has this disease has broken up my family. It's left us in bankruptcy. It's caused divorce in my family. My older children don't understand all the attention. It's caused my older children to rebel and to become delinquent teenagers. I mean, it's destroyed our life. The cost goes on and on and on. And some of these diseases, you don't just get out of the hospital and go home and you're all right all of a sudden. They go on for a lifetime. The after effects of some of these diseases last a lifetime. The cost of that on the social system, the medical care system, the educational system is phenomenal. It's got to be, we've got to educate people that the cost of a vaccine compared to the cost of the disease, there's no comparison.
This is an emotional issue, and unfortunately the facts and numbers don't speak for themselves. That, you know, stories resonate, and you know, those who are critical of vaccines have been very, very effective at getting out their stories. And, you know, we haven't been as effective.
I think one thing we haven't spent enough time talking about today is how well vaccines work. I mean, smallpox has been eliminated from the planet. Polio is almost eliminated from the planet. Measles is beginning to be eliminated from Africa and has been eliminated in the United States for years until we started to see little outbreaks because of people who don't get immunized. And to share a story about the effectiveness of vaccines, when I was a resident, we used to see a case of Haemophilus meningitis every single week in our children's hospital. And babies who got that infection ended up with some of the problems that Frankie has described amongst the people in her network. It's a very bad and devastating disease. We now have an excellent vaccine for that disease, and I have not seen a case of that disease in 5 years. None of the pediatric residents and medical students in San Diego have ever seen a case of that disease. So we have completely eliminated it, so much so that the doctors don't even know what the disease is. And that just shows how powerful vaccines can be. And I want us to keep that in mind as we're talking about this subject.
Very good. Very good. Dr. Parikh?
I think that the power of anecdote will always trump the power of data. And the ability for us as a group collectively to take our data and transform that into something emotionally compelling is very important. And we really need to do this faster than more slowly at this point.
We don't assess risk all that well, and I think that's a big part of the problem too. When you do hear an anecdote, You don't want it to happen to you, and you're going to do what you can to make it not happen to you, regardless of whether it even happened or not. Another thing which I've noticed is that there tends to be a narrative in the news media, and people do still attend to the news media, TV news, magazine articles, entertainment shows, Oprah and so on. And I think it's very vital there to change the narrative. Right now, the narrative is this is a controversy, okay, which opens up the possibility that, okay, there's a risk factor there, okay. Well, there is no controversy. And I just cringe when I hear that. It's almost like it's just shorthand for, a reporter was too lazy to look into it,
Well,
so we'll just call it a
and
controversy.
news convention, by nature, as is about controversy and conflict, and so often that is what makes a story. If you take away that element, there's not much of a story that's going to sell papers or get much viewership.
Mm-hmm.
You've heard quite a bit. You have a decision to make tomorrow, no less, on this very subject.
I do.
How are you feeling now?
Well, something that came into my mind was, my daughter, my firstborn, was not immunized for rotavirus and contracted it under 3 months of age, and it was, first-time mom, and it was very, very scary, and she was near hospitalization from it, and it's been available for my second 2 children. So I was just so grateful, that they didn't have to go through that, but it was something that they came through on the other side of, and so I can't imagine, what Frankie's had to live through. And so I really, going in tomorrow with Grayson, I think that I am going to make sure that I get taken as seriously as I feel about the issue, and that if I don't feel that my pediatrician is understanding sort of the gravity of what happened and is really hearing my concerns and feeling that they're valid, that I probably won't make any decisions about doing it tomorrow, but seeking someone who will listen and who does understand.
I do happen to have a doctor right here.
I know.
We won't be there tomorrow for the conversation, but I'll tell you what, Dr. Parikh, do us a favor and show us what the conversation should look like.
Well, I would take your concern seriously, and I think we would have to kind of slow down and talk about it. And I think that one of the things that pediatricians or doctors in general feel these days is a sense of hurry because they've got to keep moving to get to the next patient, But there are moments where you need to slow down. And thankfully, due to vaccines, it's not because the next kid who's going to walk in with Haemophilus influenza, but it's going to be the parent who's concerned about vaccines and have questions and bring resources. And our conversation would have to really be pretty comprehensive. And maybe not just one, and certainly not just one conversation. Right. I think it'd have to be maybe more than one. But we have to we're a partner. This is a partnership between a doctor and a patient, or in this case, a parent and their child's pediatrician. And that partnership needs to be respected by both sides to come to some conclusion. And really not to coerce you or to intimidate you or to make you feel like you're doing the wrong thing, but just to make sure you understand what the right decision is for you, and that you understand the risks and benefits on both ends of that.
You also have to think that if you don't immunize him, that he may come across measles next week, or he may come across whooping cough and end up very sick or even die from that. So I don't have an answer for you. I do understand your concern. I think Dr. Parikh has outlined the right approach, that you do have to slow down and really dissect a situation in your particular case and make a decision together about what vaccines. But I want you to remember that the diseases are out there and they're not good either.
Well, I have referrals here. I can get you second and third opinions. You concur, doctor? Doctor?
And I think I know how to find you anyway.
Good. Well, so for the time being then, let's let that be our last word on this round. Thank you all, participants, and thank you out there in the studio audience and viewers at home.